Oh, wow. Okay. Are we here? All right. Hello, and thank you, and apologies for the mix-up there. Welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. For whoever shows up to this after I mistakenly posted the wrong link to the patrons a number of times. I'm grateful for all of you who are here, and happy to see you. So welcome to the second patron-only news brief. Look, we've got three people here. I'm delighted and surprised to see that. After I screwed up this majorly, I'm delighted to see you guys here on a Saturday. Here, it's a beautiful afternoon in northern Michigan, and I know it's a range of different places. Loga, you're in Malaysia, I assume, and other folks who will chime in. We've got the live chat going. One of the nice things about these patron-only live chats is that I can respond to almost every comment that's made. Loga has suggested that I should resend the email links or something. I did. I resent it on Patreon, so it should show up for folks and function appropriately. So I have sent that email too many times, and people should be back here. I am checking I will continue to check the messages to make sure I'm doing things right. But okay, so I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things that I want to discuss. As I go through this news brief format, I will pause after each one to deal with any comments that may come up, any comments, questions, what have you. With the news brief, I try to deal in some depth with issues, well, not much depth, with issues that this channel covers, but because, I mean, over 5 years, we've now built up a number of different countries that we try to cover in depth and don't have the opportunity to put together a produced video on all of them every month. So this channel, this news brief allows sort of quicker, briefer updates, and I'm excited to be able to do that. And now we have 4 people watching. This is exciting. This is good. I'm not doing this for nobody. Even if I was doing this for nobody, I would do the news brief format anyway, which would be available exclusively to patrons that have this link. Let me say thank you to the folks who are here. It's a tremendously valuable thing that you guys do. This More Freedom Foundation thing, this whole project is impossible without you guys. So I'm very grateful. Okay, first off, Libya. Libya had a very exciting sort of May. Things changed very quickly. Khalifa Haftar, the strongman who's supported by a range of despots the world over, from Donald Trump, not the US government, but Donald Trump, to France, to Russia, to the UAE, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. His offensive, his year-long offensive against Western Libya, the internationally sponsored government, internationally recognized government in Tripoli, failed catastrophically, spectacularly, which I would argue is a very good thing. It's troubling, like what this means going forward. Turkey had a very positive, I think, role in finally ending Haftar's offense at Tripoli, but what does this mean going forward? I said about a month ago, I think in this live chat format, that my hunch was that Haftar would still sort of hold on to power in the east, and that the offensive would stop at a certain place, because and I think this remains true with developments in Libya. What's actually happening in Libya is, to some extent, the product of forces on the ground and, military power back and forth, that sort of thing. But really, I think at this point, it's certainly this year, it's a product of negotiations between Russia and Turkey. Turkey is supporting the internationally UN recognized government in the West. And Russia is the most powerful entity supporting, well, I guess Donald Trump's fairly powerful, but fairly meaningless, ineffective, and incapable of using his own government to make change or affect policy. So Russia is the most powerful element supporting Khalifa Haftar and the Libyan government in the east. It's very hard for me to keep East and West going. So it's really like what we're seeing in Libya. I'd suggested back in May, and I think has now been confirmed that we're seeing the product of a negotiation between Russia and Turkey. The Turkish military forces, the drones, the sort of paramilitaries, the Syrian, Syrian rebel Al Qaeda types that the Turkey sort of not vacuumed, sort of fire hosed into Libya certainly made a difference on the ground, but it's not like they overwhelmed all the Russian mercenaries. The Russian mercenaries pulled out to a certain extent because there had been a negotiated agreement, like, okay, like we're going to let Haftar's offensive die on the part of the Russians, but you're only going to go so far. And my understanding is a month later, the front line remains Sirte, Sirte. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that appropriately, but a very sad town in the middle of Libya on the coast. Most of Libya's population is coastal, and Sirte is a coastal town sort of in the middle of Libya that has been battled back. It was important in the fight to overthrow Gaddafi. It's been battled back and forth. And now, once again, I believe Sirte is sort of the negotiated front line. The big news, supposedly big news from Libya, was Egypt started really rattling their swords, talking about a potential intervention in Libya or a potential confrontation with Turkey. Egypt, of course, is located directly to the east of Libya. They share a long border with Libya. For a range of reasons, I don't take this threat particularly seriously. I don't think it's particularly likely. This idea that Egypt under Sisi is going to get involved in Libya to the extent that it's actually going to start some kind of conflict with Turkey. Obviously, this is like a frightening prospect. I mean, Turkey and Egypt are obviously still U.S. allies. Turkey's position, I think, is supposedly more jeopardized as a U.S. ally, though it shouldn't be. I was part of the Gezi protests against Erdogan. I got tear gassed a little, I think, in a month of nationwide uprisings. 5 people died, largely out of accident and exhaustion, whereas Sisi inaugurated his dictatorship, never fairly elected president. He inaugurated his dictatorship by murdering, I think, 1,000 people. Yet somehow Sisi is the safer U.S. ally than Erdogan, which is grim. But anyway, so this has prompted a lot of hand-wringing. Oh, are Egypt and Turkey going to get into a conflict? And I think that's largely horse shit. I think, thinking initially I was very dismissive of the idea of Egypt getting involved in Libya at all, because Egypt is now doing military exercises close to the Libyan border. They've made noise about the possibility of, invading Libya to support Haftar. They have named Turkey as a negative influence. So my hunch is that this is going to go absolutely nowhere and is not something that's going to happen. But I suppose it is possible that there would be some kind of Egyptian intervention in Libya, and absolutely that'd be, all anybody would talk about for one 24-hour news cycle. But I don't think it would lead to much. I think it would still be in the context of this agreement between Turkey and Russia that we're going to sort of hold things at Sirte. I think if Haftar is going to fall, he'd have to fall due to democratic elements that he's been resolutely crushing in eastern Libya. So the Egyptians could possibly, as like some kind of prestige play, or just to cater to the United Arab Emirates and, to further become like the Sudanese or the Somalis or the Pakistanis. Actually, I think the Pakistanis are now too respectable to act as Saudi Arabia and the UAE's sort of shock troops or cannon fodder. I think it's possible that Egypt could take on that role in eastern Libya. That's imaginable. But I think the sort of more panicked imaginings of like, are Egypt and Turkey going to go to war in the middle of Libya? I think that doesn't strike me as at all credible, frankly. Mostly because Turkey would just absolutely wipe the floor with Egypt. I mean, you look at, Egypt is a very militarily focused country. Their military has been a tremendously important part of their whole modernization process, from Muhammad Ali to Urabi to Nasser, and it's a military that's way too dominant in their culture. But it's just not. I mean, it's not a. It's a military that's supported by aid. I'm sure that it has the power to be dominant in much of Africa, but Turkey is a top 20 world economy, with a military that unfortunately has been getting a lot of practice recently, in other countries. If Turkey were to try to invade Egypt, obviously that'd be a completely different question, and Turkey would lose. But the idea that Egypt is going to project power into Libya and pose a serious threat to the Turkish military forces is laughable to me. So yeah, if we do see Egypt go into Libya, I think it's to be very much in the context of Turkish and Russian agreement, quiet agreement, and yeah, it'll be sort of more of a political ploy. It won't be a real military confrontation between Turkey and Egypt. So that's the big sort of Libya news that we've gone through. I would love it if we could see Haftar fall, some kind of negotiation between Libya. I do, between the differing. It's not halves. It's tempting to say halves because it's the eastern and western half, but really. Eastern Libya is much smaller population, much smaller economic weight. That sort of little patch of Western Libya that Haftar had not yet taken under control and now has lost completely is, I'm pretty sure, the vast majority of Libya's population. But I do think that there's a real concern now that after the United States destroyed the place 9 years ago, like we've now gotten to a point where it's sort of a partition of Libya, which is a real shame. I mean, honestly, as far as like countries that are viable to be divided, Libya is probably pretty high on that list. I mean, it's not super difficult, sort of oil resources and population, and there's a lot of empty space there that you can draw some borders through. But I just think it's generally kind of sad. I think one of the great sources of peace is over the past 70 years is just simply borders no longer getting revised. So, I mean, as we've seen in South Sudan, a country that I think almost certainly, the more I read about it, the more it seems that the case for independence there was incontrovertible. That was a disaster, even though it continues to be a disaster, even though it was something that almost certainly had to happen. So the idea of Libya devolving into an Eastern and Western Libya it's sort of sad to me, and not something that I particularly look forward to. But that may be what's happening, though that nothing's guaranteed about that either. It's just that is sort of a evolving sense that I get. All right, we've got 5 people here now. This is great. I'm pleased. I apologize once again for the confusion with the links. I'm glad that 5 people have found their way here. If we keep 5 people, we could very well be on our way to blowing out the total viewership of the last Patreon only news update, which had 15 people total. So, this is great because people do pop on and pop off. I'm happy to have 5 folks here. I think that's higher than we ever had last time. Okay, so questions. We've got. Does anybody have anything they want to talk about with Libya? Any opinions on that? In the comments, it seems that we've mostly just got. I gotta. Do you want to give me? I know the Hebrew character fella here as. What do I need? G something on Twitter. Very prolific Twitter commenter. Do you want to give Is there an English? Approximation of your name I can use, the Hebrew language gentleman. But so I've got Loga and is it where is that? Gilead or something? Commenting. So we have questions. Gilad, yes, okay. So we've got Gilad and Loga mostly commenting. Do we have questions about what's going on in Libya? Gilad asks, what about Ethiopia? Which is, I think, a very interesting question. So who was it? Someone in the comments made this incredibly depressing thing. It was an Egyptian made an incredibly depressing commentary. It was like, yeah, back in the 1950s, Egypt was combating, was going toe to toe with France, England, and Israel. In the 2020s, Egypt's going toe to toe with Ethiopia and Sudan, which is, Ethiopia and Sudan are two fascinating, nascently powerful countries themselves, but it does, I think, in Egypt, it's certainly perceived as a bit of a falling down. But the Egyptian conflict with Ethiopia and to a lesser degree with Sudan is a conflict from time immemorial. That's truly a sort of a mortal conflict because the basis of that conflict is water. The origins of the Nile River, without which Egypt and its 100 million lives are essentially impossible, is very dependent on Ethiopia, very dependent on water sources that originate in Ethiopia and I believe South Sudan. You get the White Nile and the Blue Nile, flow through Sudan and then flow down into Egypt. And I believe Ethiopia, I don't know too much about the conflict. I haven't read up on it as much as I'd like, but my understanding is that Ethiopia now wants to do a large hydroelectric dam or possibly divert sources of the Blue Nile for, is it the Blue Nile or the White Nile? I can't quite recall. I think it's the White Nile. Divert some of that for its own agricultural purposes. And riparian, I think they're called riparian rights or sort of rights to water is something I've never quite understood. I don't have a position on Ethiopian rights versus Egyptian rights. I can speak to the existential importance of this issue for Egypt. It's the Nile that has made Egypt wealthy in former centuries. It is the Nile that feeds, Egypt hasn't been able to feed itself since at some point in the mid-20th century, but the Nile remains extraordinarily important. It's interesting, if Egypt were a wealthy country, it's fascinating, like you sort of just look at what a wealthy country can do. The Netherlands is a classic example. I think is it Denmark or the Netherlands that just has this extraordinary, I think it's Denmark, that is just one of the largest agricultural exporters on the planet. Yet they do it with the footprint of a tiny country. Denmark's got to be, what is it, half to a quarter the size of Michigan, the state in which I'm spending July. So if Egypt was actually a wealthy country, this wouldn't be that important. But Egypt has failed to become a wealthy country for quite some time, as I demonstrated in some videos, about a month back. I'm behind schedule on my videos. Okay. What about Ethiopia? Gilad says, I don't understand the end game in Libya, and I don't either. I think the saddest thing about Libya is that it's a sign of neglect. I feel like the number of powers that are sort of exerting themselves there are exerting themselves to exert themselves. I think that's part of the thing. It's just sort of like, ooh, like this is a place where we can we can do things and we can look powerful. And it's also it's a proving ground for a lot of technologies. Turkish drone, the Turks have developed, it's sad to see that it's in the defense industry, but it's nice to see some technological leadership out of Turkey, but they are apparently market leaders in budget drones, and they're trying a lot of that equipment out in Libya. The UAE is doing the same. It's this weird, sad mess. One more thing I wanted to say on Libya is, like, what's very interesting is that the reason, Turkey has a number of reasons why they're involved in Libya, from the fact that they resent being kicked out of there back in 1908 by the Italians, the part of the demise of the Ottoman Empire, to just general, dick wagging and some, Muslim Brotherhood solidarity. But I think the main reason that Turkey is at least justifying being involved in Libya is because that allows them to do a deal with the Libyan government that gives them access to oil resources that the Cypriots, the Israelis, and certainly the Greeks, Cypriots, Israelis, and Greeks, with some subsidiary participation by the Egyptians, thought were just theirs. But Turkey has made an agreement with Libya about the water in between their two countries. Once again, I haven't bothered to weigh in on the legal output or ramifications of that, mostly because I think it's kind of a moot point. That this sort of gas resources. I mean, there's a lot of breathless articles for a decade, feels like a decade now, about what's going to happen with the gas resources around Cyprus and the new geopolitical battle space, and nobody's really paying much attention to the fact that nobody wants those gas resources anymore. They're sort of complicated undersea resources that in a swamped global market that I believe is going to remain swamped. I mean, it's funny, like oil prices have gone up and down in interesting ways before sort of crashing crashing in 2014 and never really coming back. The natural gas prices never really came back from 2008. So this whole broader geopolitical energy politics economic angle to the Libya thing that you'll read about in every article on sort of Turkish involvement in Libya just strikes me as silly. I believe the Israelis are accessing some gas resources between their coast and Cyprus, because it makes sense for them for sort of a broad range of geostrategic reasons. Turkey, I could see maybe doing some of that for the same reason. One of Turkey's great blessings, actually, is that it is not a petrostate and never has been. But as far as broader wealth and economic participation, and I don't think it makes any real sense for Greece or Egypt, or people just don't need natural gas that badly. That was sort of something I wanted to say there. Okay, what about Ethiopia? I don't understand the end game in Libya. Yeah, I don't either. It's just sad. That's interesting. So here's Local Extreme. That's some very cool Googling. So the Gezi protests back in 2013. So here's something grim. The Gezi protests back in 2013, which was a very radicalizing thing for me. It's probably why I ended up doing this YouTube channel full time. It was sort of an uprising against Erdogan that was sold in the US and Western media as this horrifically oppressive thing that Erdogan was doing to his people. The Gezi protests, this was a month-long nationwide uprising, very intense, went on for months. The Gezi protests killed 11 people. The U.S. protests since June, late May and June, killed 26, which is, that doesn't quite say as much. The U.S. is population-wise, we're still 3 to 4 times larger than Turkey. But it's something I've said all along, and I think it's very true, that the U.S., I said during Gezi, and I think it's been very confirmed by just the endless videos of police brutality we see now, that if American police had been in Turkey during the Gezi protests, dozens more would have died. Okay. Yeah, Local Cool Extreme points out that one of the... yeah. Oh, Jesus. Why is my connection unstable? Hopefully that won't happen again. Apologies. Yep, my connection is unstable. That doesn't sound good. Please be reconnecting. Please be reconnecting. Please be reconnecting. I've closed everything else. Hopefully this will continue to work. I'm just going to keep answering the questions. It seems like it's still going. If you want to verify, someone in the chat, that this is still going. So why is Trump diverging from his own government? That's a great question. I think the answer is very straightforward. We know what's going on. It's still really blurry, but I'm here. Okay, I've closed everything else. Hopefully no one else is interneting here. So why is Trump diverging from his own government? Isn't he, the commander in chief? Yes, he should be able to get the U.S. government to follow his own policy, but he hasn't even tried in Libya. Basically, he's been bought by the Saudis, which we all know. And the Saudis liked Haftar in Libya. So Trump said nice things about Haftar and basically okayed his offensive, even though the entire U.S. government, U.S. State Department, U.S. established policy is in support of the UN-supported government. Last year, Trump was like, yeah, let Haftar try and take over the country, which is just absurd. Okay, good. We are going back to normal. I've closed everything else on my computer. I think we should hopefully be okay. That's one of the perils of being up here for July. And one of the reasons I'm doing this on a weekend, so nobody else in this house is working. So hopefully we won't get booted off. We've made it through 25 minutes on one of my items. Okay, I need to speed this up. Okay, let's go through these comments more quickly. So why is Trump diverging from his own government? Okay, so that's why. It doesn't make sense for Egypt to fight in Libya when Ethiopia has hands on Egypt's water. That's a very good point, Gilad. Yeah, and also Egypt's also diverted by stuff in the Sinai that's supposedly resolved. I mean, Egypt is a country that can't fully control its own massive, massive borders. I mean, Egypt is a country that's mostly around the Nile and in the Delta, and then they've got these vast deserts that they're already having trouble controlling. The idea that they're going to get into a real deal interstate war with Turkey and Libya seems very hard to credit. No matter how badly, like I was reading some like Arab news, sort of Saudi propaganda talking about that, like it was a credible thing this morning, and it's just laughable. Okay. Gilad pointing out that he's a guy who lives in a proxy state. Okay, so the actual petroleum resources take about a decade to finalize. He points out, yeah, I mean, that's the thing is that people were so excited about these discoveries around Cyprus, 10 years ago or so when they first came up, and the market is very different now. It's not so important. Gilad says, how the hell is Greece right now? Europe's most successful country. I'm not sure how that happens. Oh, I guess Greece is doing well with COVID. I did not know that. That sounds great because Greece could stand to catch a break. Yeah. Okay, still going. All right, we're here. Fantastic. We got 4 people here. Okay, now we've gone through the comments. Let's talk about the WHO. So I think I've spent a lot of time belaboring this point in the last chat, but the World Health Organization is being held out as a scapegoat, despite the fact that the entire budget of the World Health Organization is, I think, it's a third less than the New York Police Department. It is a organization with a absurdly complex, absurdly difficult job that has been given pennies to do it. The World Health Organization is an international scandal, not because of its failings, but because of how neglected it has been. And what we should be doing right now is rampaging to give the World Health Organization more resources, more expertise, more folks to do its incredibly vital job. Instead, the President of the United States has now, and I think we can say now, was we perhaps couldn't have said as clearly a month ago, the United States has the worst COVID response in the world, especially considering the amount of wealth and resources that the United States does have to bring to bear. We're not quite this dystopian and bad a country as we look like at this point. It's just that our president has not used the resources he has to do anything positive. So it's this heartbreaking, horrifying development that we all sort of have to deal with. And one of Trump's answers to this is to blame the World Health Organization. The case that the World Health Organization, and I'm surprised most media concedes this point to Trump. They're like, oh, well, the WHO was too friendly to China. And it just pisses me off because nobody makes the point that, like, the World Health Organization is supposed to be subservient to China. China's where the diseases come from, like it's a totalitarian state, and it is the WHO's business to stay on the good side of that totalitarian state so they can do the vital, necessary research in China. If like the World Health Organization was like, nah, fuck you, China, you're totalitarian. That's not what the World Health Organization is here to do. Like the World Health Organization is very interested. Its duty is to be in China and whatever they have to do politically to make that happen has to happen. There's also the issue of funding. I mean, the United States should be funding more. So I have zero truck and zero sympathy with the idea that the World Health Organization has done anything wrong other than not have enough money, because the countries in the world, from the United States to Europe to China, did not give them enough money and resources. But because Trump is a petulant child, he first, a couple months back, as why I discussed it, froze U.S. funding. And on July 6th, he announced that he is taking the United States out of the World Health Organization in the middle of a global pandemic, which is just about the dumbest, fucking, most childish thing I can imagine. The positive thing is this actually doesn't mean anything. Thanks to treaty obligations, it's July 6th, 2021 would be when we are leaving the World Health Organization. Just generally, I have been confident, I've got videos, why Donald Trump is going to lose in November. And as the sort of COVID disaster, policing disaster, as these things continue to unfold, Trump's support is evaporating. So I think and unfortunately, we're going to see deaths ramping up again in the United States fairly shortly. And I think at that point, Trump's reelection is going to go from a nightmare story to a complete fantasy. So I'm not worried about that. It is worth noting that, like, this World Health Organization thing is part of a number of other things that Trump has been doing that it's easy for me to just sort of go over them, because I'm just assuming, well, he's going to be gone in November, and these things are all easy to overturn when he's gone. He'll be voted out in November, but he won't be gone until January, which is another grim interregnum that we're going to have to worry about. But all these insane things that he's doing, specifically with our immigration system, he had already, I think many people argue, and I think it's maybe a little overblown, but I think that he's already managed to kill the U.S. sort of immigration machine. And a lot of the stuff that he's doing now is just frankly insane, sort of freezing green cards, just plain not printing out naturalization paperwork. All of this stuff is horrifying if you're assuming that Trump's going to be there for another 4 years. My assumption now is that he's not going to be here for another 4 years. So this WHO thing is easy to laugh off, but yeah, if Trump is still here next year, then yeah, the United States no longer participates in international global health stuff, because that's the takeaway you want from the COVID crisis, that the U.S. should have less impact and do less funding of pandemic prevention. That's your takeaway. So that's a horrifying prospect. But again, I'm just assuming he's not going to be here after January. So, all right. So the Israel-Palestine thing, there are a couple of things that happened over the past couple of weeks. I do not discuss. So I should go into the comments. Okay, questions. America first. Gilad says, do you have hopeful predictions for 2020? Absolutely. Yeah, I think that. I have always thought that Trump was going to lose. My concern, there's some of it is fear-mongering, but I think there's very real concerns about voting, the integrity of the voting process in the United States. In a lot of places, I think you can make a very strong argument that the election was stolen in 2000. George W. Bush versus Al Gore in 2000. That election was stolen in Florida. So I think it was possible to have concerns. They were never particularly strong concerns, because the states that Trump has to win, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, even before the coronavirus thing, he was pretty far underwater. Plus, those jurisdictions are still, historically and still largely controlled by Democrats. So there weren't going to be large-scale disqualifications from voting. There weren't going to be, closures of voting spaces in African-American neighborhoods, the way that we're going to see in Georgia and Kentucky and places like that. So I was never too worried about the voting fraud thing. With COVID and other, just like Trump's continuing just sort of spiral into incomprehensibility and complete failure. I've gotten a lot less concerned about the voting instability because this is something I learned in Turkey. Like you can, if you're running an authoritarian state, if you're running if you've got your hands on a lot of levers of power, as the Republican Party has throughout the southern states, you can fudge elections. You can do what George W. Bush did. George W. Bush's people did in Florida in 2000. You can push it over if it's a question of a few thousand votes or like a percent or two. You can manipulate things, but we're talking now in terms of Trump having like 4%, 6%, 10%. In a lot of nationwide polls, Donald Trump is 10% down at this point. And that is almost guaranteed, not 100% guaranteed, because coronavirus is probably just going to get worse, but it's almost guaranteed that that's going to narrow significantly. But I don't think it's going to narrow significantly enough to be within that margin of fuckery where like Republican voter suppression techniques can give them an election that they don't deserve. I just think that at this point, the margin is too large. I do think that Donald Trump is going to lose and is going to lose big. At this point, I'm beginning to shift my focus into how can we drive enough Republicans out of the Senate that the Democrats can rebuild this country. Because that's what the Democrats do. You know, it's really emphasized for me. I made a video earlier this year about the fourth Republican disaster. And that's what happens. Like Republicans come into power, they fuck everything up. They treat the country like it's they kill the golden goose of the country. They sort of put throw the Keynesian levers to give quick economic growth and run us into ditches. That's what George W. Bush did in 8 years. That's what Donald Trump has done in just 4 years. And then the Democrats have to come in and clean up. The problem is we're in such a disastrous state that we have to drive as many Republicans as possible out of the other levels of government to give the Democrats any hope of fixing this nightmare. I think Trump's going to lose. But what's important at this point now is making sure he loses bigger and driving Republicans out of government, out of the Senate. Because we can't, I think that the Democratic majority in the House is going to increase. But what really matters is the Senate. And it's important to remember that there's only a third of the Senate is up in every 2-year cycle because they have 6-year terms. So yeah, it's possible. I don't think it's even, I'm not sure if it's possible with the map we have now. The map is changing and developing. It might be possible to get Democrats 60 votes in the Senate, but I think it's very important that we do so. Actually, no, I don't think it's possible unless things get even worse for Trump, which I think we have to make sure they do. Anyway, that's a lot of election talk. I really think the WHO is still downplaying coronavirus, says Gilad. That's interesting. I'm not sure if I'd necessarily agree with that. I don't know, man. I said at the beginning of this, and I'm very glad I said at the beginning of this, that I am not a science guy. I think Logan can tell you I was like, sure, the warmer weather should totally deal with the coronavirus. I don't fucking know. And I'm glad I was upfront about not fucking knowing because I do not know. So I don't know. Maybe Gilad's a doctor and can tell us that coronavirus is being undersold by the WHO. But the WHO, you shouldn't look to them for political guidance. Like you should look to them for limited degrees of medical guidance, but like mostly they're gathering the information. And if they have to kiss up to China to gather that information, I'm perfectly fine with that. All right. On the note of COVID, I think Iran is having the worst second wave. Not really. I'm sorry to hear that. Seen pictures of sick people being treated in their own cars. All hospital beds are full. Well, that's pretty horrifying. Gilad, is it bad that I predict COVID deaths in the U.S. surpassing 2004's tsunami, which killed 250,000 deaths at best? Yeah, I think. I think the U.S. that doesn't seem unreasonable. COVID killing 250,000 people. We're already closing in on 150,000 people in the United States. 250 sounds likely. No, Gilad, more people did not, in fact, die from listening to Nickelback. 250,000 people is a lot of dead people, even if they are old people. More Freedom Foundation. So if China benefits from the U.S. leaving the WHO, why don't they pay the full amount the U.S. used to pay? It's not like they couldn't afford it. Well, because it's politics. You want to nickel and dime these places and make them more more receptive to your agenda. That's, I think, a very short-sighted and stupid way of dealing with something as vital and as important as the World Health Organization. But that's certainly what the United States has done for decades, and that's certainly what China is doing today. It's unfortunate. And it's not like it's no money we're talking about here. I mean, the WHO's budget is absurdly low, but it is still $4 billion. Yeah, that was something that I wanted to talk about the WHO. It's just insane to me. So, in the article I read, it's clear that the Congress wants to fund the WHO anyway, despite what Trump wants. And our annual funding of the World Health Organization, our front line for pandemic prevention is $200 million. For context, I think it's estimated currently that we spend $50 billion in Afghanistan every year, doing absolutely nothing of any note or worth. So that is, we are spent 250 times as much money in Afghanistan this year as we were spending on the World Health Organization. So, all right, getting to Israel-Palestine. It's funny talking about Israel-Palestine, and then the internet shuts down. I'm noteworthy for not talking about Israel-Palestine. I just felt like I haven't done enough reading. But there are a couple events this month that I felt that needed to be talked about because it's really just showing, how horrific Benjamin Netanyahu's legacy is for Israel. Netanyahu, over his, God, Gilad, what has it been, 15 years, 20 years now? It feels like 20 years, but it's been at least a decade that Netanyahu has been in power in Israel. He was sort of saved by the coronavirus and now has another term. His main legacy is going to be making Israel a partisan issue in the United States. And there's certainly some Republican strategists and Donald Trump and Fox News people who see this as some kind of victory for the Republican Party, and maybe it is. But if you're a Zionist, if you're somebody who cares about Israel, if you're somebody who cares about the Jewish state, it is a nightmarish development. And we've seen the way this is working out. I think as part of his holding on to his seat, Netanyahu has been promising, I haven't been going into this as much detail as I perhaps should have, promising the annexation of certain territories in the West Bank. I think the Jordan Valley, is that right? Basically, even further screwing over the Palestinians after having screwed the Palestinians for decades. And what's really interesting is the pushback that this is finally getting in the United States. I think one of the most notable was Peter Beinart. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that appropriately. I think he was a New Republic guy, fairly DC establishment, well-respected thinker on these sort of things. And he's a Jewish fellow, formerly quite Zionist, as it pretty much comes with the mother's milk in the United States. I consider myself a fairly hardcore Zionist until Netanyahu went and decided to lecture our president in the Houses of Congress. That sort of killed it for me. But, Beinart, respectable journalistic figure, and he came out last week with a figure saying, the two-state solution, with an article saying the two-state solution is dead. He wrote a long-form version in Jewish Currents, which is sort of the left-wing Jewish, one of the left-wing Jewish outlets. But what was surprising is, and I have not actually read this, unfortunately, but Beinart actually got an op-ed in the New York Times saying the same thing, which is pretty extraordinary. To see the New York Times writing stuff, basically saying to have an article in the New York Times basically saying it's time to give up on the Jewish state is pretty extraordinary. I'm not sure I agree with that position. I think it's pretty extreme. I might still be a two-stater. But it's hard to argue that Israel has done anything to make that a two-state solution viable. I mean, they slowly carve off. They've been just slowly carving off land, and this sort of Netanyahu, we're going to annex a whole big other chunk of the land beyond the settlements we've already been taking. I think in the Beinart article, I read the Jewish Currents one, or most of it, and they pointed out that in the in sort of 2000, there were like 50,000 Jewish settlers in Palestinian land. No, that was in 1980, and like in 2000 there were 400,000. Now there's like 700,000. It's like a seventh of the population of Israel is on Palestinian land in the West Bank at this point. So it's obviously the two-state solution is functioning as a way for people like, oh, we care about the Palestinians, yay, two-state solution. But if you're saying that and saying absolutely nothing about the ongoing settlement policy, you're obviously not caring about Palestinians or caring about the two-state solution. And what was interesting with this article was that this guy, fairly well-respected establishment figure, was saying, like, actually, the two-state solution is pretty dead, and what we need is a one-state solution where Palestinians have equal rights in Israel, which is pretty like mind exploding for somebody who's been paying attention to these things for a couple decades. And the fact that he was given an op-ed in the New York Times to say this is pretty crazy. So the thing is, like, this sort of like, oh, we love the two-state solution, let's ignore Israel, slowly making that impossible. That was just U.S. policy for 40 years. But what Netanyahu has done is he's killed that by attacking Obama so openly, and by just making things so brutally obvious in the mistreatment of the Palestinians. And we saw that. I'm not confident we actually have the results from the Eliot Engel Jamal Bowman Democratic primary in New York yet. That was a couple weeks back. It takes New York as really horrifically bad electoral system that we don't pay as much national attention to, just because it's such a firmly Democratic place that the results aren't typically very surprising. But this was a surprising result. I believe Engel had been in the U.S. Congress for 30 years, representing districts in New York, sort of Westchester County in the Bronx. And he's probably one of the most hawkish Democrats there are. He chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee of the Democrats, and he's basically like loves war, loves Israel, hates the Palestinians, yada yada. He was the big guy, the most prominent Democrat, attacking Ilhan Omar's general pro-peace, pro-dignity policies the most vociferously. And it looks like he's lost his primary to Jamal Bowman, African-American. I think he was a elementary school teacher or principal, or not. He was a public school teacher or principal in New York City. Charismatic fella, and very much the actual. I think people have been overselling like what this means about foreign policy or support for Israel from a political standpoint. Like, nobody gives a shit what representing a largely person of color district for a very long time, and he was seen as out of touch. And during COVID, he didn't come back to New York. He stayed in Maryland. To overstate how important this is, that is like politically the loss of Engel. There was definitely Democratic majority for Israel super PACs that were putting millions of dollars into this race, into a Democratic House primary. Those millions are now actually trying to primary out Ilhan Omar in Minnesota. We'll probably talk about that. I think that's in August. We'll probably talk about that. So it's kind of crazy that Engel has lost, looks to have lost. They're still counting absentee ballots. This is New York. It's corrupt as hell. You can just be like, oh, look at this. We just found another 40,000 votes for Engel. Holy shit. So I don't guarantee yet that Bowman has won. I think it's very likely, and that is a sea change, and that is a sign of a real shift in U.S. approach to Israel. It's also kind of heartening. I have a lot of folks who follow. I don't think too many on the Patreon list who have a very Israel controls everything. The Israel lobby controls everything. Just very one-sided sort of anti-Semitic approach to foreign policy, U.S. government politics in general, and it's kind of nice to see. Well, actually, folks, like IPAC just got its ass kicked because losing Engel is a very, very bad thing. I mean, I think they also got their ass kicked in to a lesser extent, but because AOC is not super vocal, but I think she is very pro-Palestinian, and certainly more pro-Palestinian than her challenger in the primaries this month or past month. AOC destroyed her primary challenger. I hope and pray, and I need to do a goddamn video about Ilhan Omar's primary challenge, which happens in early August. She needs to be supported. God, there's something else I need to do. Okay, so that's what I have to say about Israel-Palestine. Questions? Hey, see you, Farzam. Thanks for showing up. Okay. I think okay. Don't have more to get on because countries would have more money than us. No. Local Cool Extreme asks, so if China benefits from the U.S. leaving the WHO, why don't they pay the full amount the U.S. used to pay? It's not like they couldn't afford it. I answered that question already. Sorry. I wonder if there's a god of economy in some mythologies. And Moloch, isn't that, Moloch, isn't he supposed to be the god of filthy lucre or something? Hindu mythology has Lakshmi, the goddess of purity and wealth. Does that kind of thing? It does. Mo Freedom Foundation says, if it's any solace, Russia is fucking up their virus handling so much they've been covering up COVID deaths by the tens of thousands. I don't see Russia as a competitor to the United, as Logo well knows. I don't see Russia as a competitor to the United States. I wish that country well, and I wish they were better governed, and I wish they'd figure things out. But as far as like significance for rivalry with the United States, I think, they've got a lot of nukes, which is a problem, but I mean, they're about as much a threat to U.S. interests as Egypt is. And I don't want anybody to have a bad time with COVID. Let's see. All right, Gilad points out there's still no suicide bombing under Netanyahu. Yeah, well, there was a wall built. And I think a lot of Palestinians have realized that didn't actually serve them at all. The suicide bombing. The thing is, there's been no suicide bombing under Netanyahu. Well, there hasn't been much serious suicide bombing in Israel for 20 years now. Yet, Israeli policy of savagery continues, which is, I think, something that people are noticing. I've noticed. Okay. Oh, that's weird. Farzam says that also Mo Freedom, you probably know, but I think videos more than 2 hours can't be seen after the 2 hours. I'm not sure that's true, but I don't think I'm going to go more than 2 hours on this one. But thanks. Gilad says Peter Beinart is not really relevant. Well, of course he's not really relevant. Nobody's really relevant. And Gilad points out that Peter Beinart does not live in Israel. The only thing that matters are the facts on the ground. I don't think that's true, frankly. I think Israel is very dependent on what the diaspora thinks. And the most powerful diaspora is located in the United States. Now, I'm not saying that, see, under the old dispensation, when both parties just sort of like automatically said, oh, yeah, Israel's true. Okay. Yeah, Palestinians are nice, I guess, but, Israel, whatever you want. Then yeah, you could say that. Didn't really matter. I think that's very much Netanyahu's attitude. He's like, yeah, who gives a fuck? Like, it's the United States. They'll do what we want. I can do whatever I want. I can go lecture the president. Who gives a fuck? I think Netanyahu's broken that. So I think Israel, the folks running Israel will find in the coming years that just how poorly Netanyahu has served them by breaking the U.S. consensus in their favor. Because there's not a lot of other people in the world who are big supporters of Israel. That's overstated. I think China and India are both big Israel supporters, and that's a lot. Yeah, I don't think it's quite true that Israel can do whatever it wants. And I think actually the fact that the New York Times is running stuff saying, okay, you want to annex the West Bank? Then I guess the two-state solution's over, and it's time to give voting rights to Palestinians in Israel. I think honestly that might slow down annexation. I think you might be surprised at how little happens with annexation because of not specific, well, to some extent, specifically because of Peter Beinart in the writing in the New York Times. I could be wrong about that, Gilad. We'll see. Local Cool Extreme says, I'm still genuinely surprised that establishment dinosaurs like Engel and Crowley were able to gain a foothold in one of the most progressive states in the US. See, the fact about the Democratic Party, I think too many people believe the Republican, too many people believe, and it's not just you, Logan. This is me, honestly, before, I started looking at things a little more rationally once Trump was elected. But I think people kind of believe the Fox News propaganda, like, oh, yeah, those Democrats, a bunch of crazy leftist commies. But no, man, like, I mean, they're generally a party that believes that government is capable of doing things that are useful and is, not a complete waste of time. It's not, shockingly socialist or communist. That's the vast majority of them. It's really only Trump's election that has begun to turn the Democratic Party like more stridently leftist. I mean, there's Bernie Sanders is not a Democrat because he did not find them to be left enough. Bernie Sanders remains not a Democrat. There have always been, like, I guess Ron Wyden or Paul Wellstone, a guy who died a number of years ago. There's always been like one or two like out there, strident, left-wing, progressive folks in the Democratic Party, but there are, hundreds of Democratic Party legislators, and I think you'll find that on balance, they're a lot closer to Eliot Engel and Joe Crowley than they are to AOC or Ilhan Omar. That's changing, I think, largely because of Trump. There's a video I need to do about how, Donald Trump has been the most effective left-wing president since LBJ. But, sorry, just remembering. I need to do an Ilhan Omar video. I should do a Judy Shelton video. Oh, that's nice. I like videos about women. Okay. So, I think I have... What was I talking about? I've forgotten completely. Oh yeah, about the establishment. So yeah, that is puzzling, but I think it's because too many people believe the Fox News hype. Democrats are generally nowhere near as rabid left wingers as they're portrayed, really everywhere. So yeah. I'm generally surprised that okay, wow, much connection, definitely worth $2. Let's see. Sorry, Gilad. I'm grateful that you signed up for Patreon. I'm sorry if you're not finding this up to your standards, but I'm grateful. Shit. So the connection is still bad. I'm sorry. At least Rob hasn't downgraded himself to doing podcasts. I don't know, man. I had some friend, a friend, and someone I widely dislike who, no, I don't dislike personally, just think his views are shit, who just started a podcast, and I'm just like, they're already more successful than I am. So I don't know, maybe I should do a podcast. Gilad points out that the COVID outbreak in the West Bank is really scary. Yeah, and I think this is something that we found over and over again, that the disadvantaged, disenfranchised populations are where the COVID spreads the fastest. It's obviously hugest in the United States among African Americans and Latinos. I think it was Singapore specifically did an amazing job crushing COVID, and then it sort of bounced back on them because they have a large sort of, I guess not quite UAE level, but they have a large sort of migrant worker population that they keep in dorms and fairly oppressed. And then COVID sort of rampaged through them and sort of bounced back on Singapore. So yeah, it's certainly been a thing. Okay. COVID outbreak in the West Bank is really scary. The West Bank economy is even worse. Also, the guy who made the 700+ tweet thread has a Twitch channel called Legal Eagle 2. Okay, it's back. Good. I'm happy to hear that the connection is back. I'm sorry it's been garbage. I got to figure out a better way to do this. Maybe I'll get an Ethernet cable. Okay, Israel's economy has now 20% unemployment and 1,500 cases a day. Jesus. Sorry about that. But Gaza only has 67 cases. Well, yeah, I suppose like complete isolation in what many would call an open-air prison will do the job for isolation. of course, when COVID eventually inevitably does arrive in Gaza, I think we can all expect it to be pretty horrifying. So local Kuchina asks, so why did Europe and the EU bungle the COVID response so much? I have a theory here that I ran through by at least one real journalist, and he says, I don't buy it. But like honestly, I think that Europe might actually defer to the CDC in disease response, and initially assume it's like, well, if the U.S. isn't making such a big deal about it, I guess we won't either. And then they just got absolutely hammered. I haven't found a lot of support for that, but I do think it's possible because I mean the CDC before this year had a sterling reputation. This is the U.S. Centers for Disease Control. Everyone had sort of assumed that they'd be there to take the lead. It wasn't because of Donald Trump. That's why Trump is blaming the WHO for failing to do what the Centers for Disease Control under Trump should have been doing. So yeah, I think Europe probably was like, well, if the US is so complacent, and they weren't under Obama during Ebola and swine flu, then oh yeah, well, I mean, Trump's not that important. Turns out Trump was important and crushed a response that should have been more robust. So yeah, that's sort of my theory of why Europe got caught out so badly. They didn't see the US panicking, so they didn't panic. And the fucked up thing now, what's emerged over the past month or so is that for a long time, one of the defenses of Trump that I think was fair was like, look, okay, the US numbers look really bad, but if you look at if you look at Spain and Italy and even the United Kingdom on a per capita basis, they've got more cases and deaths. That's not true anymore. Europe has largely caught up. European schools will be open in the fall. Yeah, so I think Europe did a terrible job and then recovered. Yeah. So yeah, Gilad points out that the CDC doesn't have a good reputation after watching all those zombie movies. That is a good point, but I do think in the real world, the CDC's reputation was fairly good, and it is no longer. Yemen, I'm currently doing a deep dive on Yemen that has lasted much longer than I had thought. Really just reading one book, but if you get one book that's a little too complicated, it can take a long time. You find yourself, I mean, I just say the generic you, but I find myself reading long science fiction series before I finish that Yemen book. But I did finally finish that Yemen book, so I'm sort of like doing a deep dive on just how, really just realizing that Saudi Arabia has been waging war against Yemen, not since 2015, but since 2009. And I'm trying to wrestle together scripts that sort of talk about the way that the sort of shifting affiliations, if you step back from the absurd shifting affiliations of people over the past 20 years, you realize that actually in Yemen, the Saudis have been trying to take over Yemen for 50 years now. And I'm trying to wrestle that into a real script. But what's extraordinary, the one thing that I think just comes true over and over again, like I decided to get back into Yemen when the Saudis looked to be losing Marib province, which would basically mean that they were completely barred from half the country, not just in population terms, because they've always been barred from like 80% of the population, which the Houthis have always controlled. But if they'd lost in Marib, which I don't believe they have yet, that would have meant that the Saudis just had no way to access most of the battle space in Yemen. Like that would have been, that's when I was like, oh, I need to get back into Yemen, do some videos. So that actually, they seem to have held on to Marib, but the deal that they had made with the southern elements, not the Houthis, who are now in complete control of the 20% that the Houthis don't control. No, sorry, that's wrong. But are in control of another large chunk of the 20% of the country that's supposedly under Hadi, the internationally recognized president who's always lived in Saudi Arabia. So yeah, I mean, it's just because of COVID, Yemen is getting more and more horrific. The loss of life is getting more and more absurd. The pretensions of a ceasefire that we heard about a couple months back are over. Bombing is intensifying. Death is intensifying. And the Saudis just keep fucking losing. The Houthis at this point are like, yeah, it's a horror show, but we can keep doing this because they just go from strength to strength to strength. It is amazing just how comprehensively Saudi Arabia has lost the Yemeni war for independence. And I'll be talking about that more in a video, hopefully coming up in the next couple of weeks. I figured I should mention criminal justice reform, and it's a really interesting thing, and it's easy, I think, to lose track of and sort of have fade away after the protests have stopped. But I think it's important to emphasize. I think Republicans were making a big deal out of like, oh, our reform. They proposed some half-assed reform in the Senate and got their one African American senator to sort of champion it. And I don't know that everything in there was worthless, but I think it was probably terribly half-assed. But all of that is sort of a sideshow to the fact that in the United States, I think I've said this before, I want to emphasize it again, the reform is state and local. Like you are not going to get criminal justice reform at the top level that is meaningful. I mean, there's a large federal prison infrastructure. It's like, I guess I wonder actually, are there more people in federal prisons than there are in California and Texas prisons? Maybe. So to that extent, if you're talking about mass incarceration, then yes, the U.S. government can make meaningful steps, but they're about as meaningful as like the California or Texas state houses as far as the reforms that they can make. They can certainly make things worse, as they did with the 1994 crime bill that sort of jacked up money for prisons, policing, and they can make things worse through sort of sweeping regulations about mandatory minimums and three strikes laws, stuff like that. But generally, the big reforms, the reforms that matter, are going to happen at the local level. And we've seen some of that. And I'm not staying as on top of it as I should be. I'm sort of diving in on Yemen and Sudan, and I should do more. But I did see something on Twitter this morning, which is just amazing. South Carolina, just sort of, it's funny because Radley Balco, a guy I follow on Twitter who's amazing on these issues. You might recall I highly recommended a 5-year-old article that he'd written on criminal justice in the St. Louis suburbs. South Carolina, seems like more through just judicial policy, has basically said we're going to stop doing no-knock warrants. And that's incredible. Breonna Taylor is a name you may have heard if you follow the sort of Black Lives Matter protests and sort of movement over the past month. She's a woman in Kentucky who was murdered by police in her sleep when they kicked down their door with no notice to, I don't know, serve a warrant or something. There were rumors of drugs that weren't not there. It was the wrong apartment, this, that, and the other thing. And they murdered Breonna Taylor. That was a no-knock warrant. It varies from state to state whether no-knock warrants are legal. In Kentucky, unfortunately, with Breonna Taylor, people are still, why have those cops not been arrested yet? Why have those cops not been arrested yet? I think from a legal standpoint, it's because they're allowed to do no-knock warrants. And if people die when they do no-knock warrants, that's seen as not their fault. It'd be great to see those folks arrested, but I'd be surprised if it happened. In South Carolina, not yet in Kentucky, but in South Carolina, if police officers try to do what they did to Breonna Taylor, they will now be prosecuted. And that's fantastic. And that's what I'm talking about. It's state level, it's piece by piece. And I wouldn't want it to be more unified. I did make a video. I do think it's important that criminal justice reform become more unified at the state level. I think where you have problems, as I talked about in that video, is when you've got 150 jurisdictions within a state with different policies and different approaches. I think consolidating from the state level and making reforms at the state level makes sense. I do not want federal level reforms. Like, that much of my libertarianism has been preserved, because what if 10 years from now, Tom Cotton is president and he says, you know what, let's just make it a national policy that police can kill Black people. Obviously, it's not going to be that explicit, but it'll be pretty close if President Tom Cotton ever happens. So I think it's very important that states retain control of their own policing. I do not think it's as important that every locality has its own policy. So yeah, I think that South Carolina. Yeah, so criminal justice reform is happening. It matters at the state level, and I think that's where we should be trying to lobby and encourage and celebrate changes. New York is another one. For decades, activists were trying to get records of police discipline opened, and then the legislature just sort of did it. I was pointing out about how Radley Balco was on Twitter this morning, kind of incredulously. It's just sort of like South Carolina just did away with no-knock warrants. The guy's been working for 20 years trying to get rid of no-knock warrants. And then South Carolina was like, yeah, this is a bad idea. We're not going to do any no-knock warrants going forward. And Radley Balco's just like, what? I mean, awesome, but that was surprisingly easy. So I do think we're in this period where, like the way that people look at things has changed so dramatically that, a lot of things are becoming possible, and it's exciting and it's positive, and I should probably spend more time focusing on it. But there's so many things I have to focus on. So I wanted to mention that. Criminal justice reform is continuing, and that should be celebrated. Saudi Arabia, just a couple things on Saudi Arabia, and that's everything I've got to go through. So, we better have some questions coming, or this is just going to be an hour and a half live chat. Saudi Arabia, one of the things that was really outrageous was that Saudi Arabia this year was the host of the G20. So despite the nightmare in Yemen, despite Khashoggi, despite the fact that people all over the world are getting disgusted with Saudi Arabia and its policies, they were going to be able to host the G20 and have everybody come in and it'd be a big diplomatic coup for them. So one positive ramification of COVID is that nobody did that. The G20 this year was a Zoom chat, or a series of Zoom chats. So this great PR victory that Saudi Arabia was supposed to get over the past month, or this month, they did not get. And I think that's friggin' fantastic. What's interesting, one of the figures that I follow, not as closely as I should, but I try to follow closely, is Saudi Arabian foreign reserves. As I've mentioned in videos, circa 2014, they had $750 billion in foreign reserves. When the oil price crashed in just a year or two, or maybe even quicker than that, it plummeted down to 500 billion. So a third of those reserves disappeared in the space of a year. They'd stabilized over the past couple of years through the appropriation of the assets of a lot of rich Saudis, through some, close to recovery in oil assets. And also, I think, because a lot of these foreign reserves are in U.S. stock, they are very large stockholders in the United States. I don't know, probably not as systemically important as some people imagine, but they've been making a lot of freaking money on the U.S. stock market, as everybody who invested in the stock market in the Trump era. Even after the COVID drop, it's now come back up. The Dow Jones is probably not the right figure to focus on, but hey, I was a stockbroker in the 20th century, so I still focus on the Dow Jones figure, and it was 16,000 when Trump was elected, close to 30,000 in January. And it's, fell all the way down to 19,000, but now it's back up around 25. So Saudi Arabia making a lot of money through that. So its foreign reserves were preserved up until March of this year, when the COVID plus oil drop hit them very hard. In March, they lost 25 billion. In April, they lost another 25 billion. So the reserves quickly went from 500 billion US dollars down to 450. At that rate, Saudi Arabia has another year or two of being viable. However, in May, they did stabilize, and that was something to notice. But the fact that they've just already lost $50 billion of reserves this year, and I don't think coronavirus is quite settled there yet. They may be on sort of the U.S.-Brazil model, which ain't great. And I think that people really haven't been reckoning with the amount of economic damage we're gonna be seeing here. The stimulus checks, the unemployment checks that were so generous, that $2 trillion stimulus that the U.S. government did runs out in I think at the end of this month. Yeah, so every unemployed person in the United States has both had their whatever state unemployment insurance scheme they have to benefit from, with horrific variation from place to place, but significant money and an additional $600 a week from the federal government. That ends July 31st. I don't see it being extended. Honestly, I don't think it should be extended because we now have the horrific realization that each individual state government, they all have their own budgets, and they can't print their own money the way the federal government can. So yeah, a lot of those state budgets that fund the unemployment that is the bulk, that's much more than $600 that people get every week. I think they're about to start going under. So I think the federal government should probably abandon the $600 and then start bailing out states so the baseline unemployment money can keep coming. So regardless, come next month, the American consumer is going to have a lot less money, and we're about to see some real disaster. And I think that too is going to affect asset prices. I mean, the Fed can do a lot, but they can't do everything. So I think that to bring that all back, I think that you'll see the value of Saudi investments drop dramatically, which will lead to the fall in valuation of a lot of Saudi assets. I'm not 100% on like the direct connection of foreign reserves to U.S. equities, but whether even if there isn't one, there's going to be enough massive effects washing around that it will have an impact on Saudi foreign reserves. So Saudi Arabia, I've said that the current Saudi system will be over by 2030. And I think that it's still very possible that COVID will result in the end of MBS's rule. I do not think that the current COVID crisis is going to be the fall of the Saudi state, but I think another crisis by the end of the 2020s will. Okay, cool. I think those are all the items I wanted to get through. We've been doing this for an hour and 20 minutes. We have 7 people, an extraordinary 7 people watching. So, I got to keep going. I mean, you folks are you guys are the folks that keep me going. Okay, so where is the question? Where are some questions? Logo Cool Extreme rubs it in a little more, pointing out that Malaysian schools are opening in 2 weeks. Yeah, my understanding is that most U.S. elementary schools will be opening in the fall, but man, it's going to be weird. Gilad is talking about a video game called The Last of Us. I don't know about it. Gilad, I think, is talking about CHOP, which has been completely resolved to the horror of Fox News producers everywhere. The Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in Seattle is no more. I don't know what Tucker Carlson's going to talk about anymore, but yeah, Seattle's anarchy was very brief and now over. Okay, so Local Cool Extreme and Gilad are getting in on video games, which is not something I really understand. Wow, so Gilad thinks that the Confederate flag and Mississippi's flag should be replaced with another Mississippi flag. So like one of those like recursive things, like mirror pictures. That'd be trippy. Man, Mississippi needs something interesting about it. I feel bad about Mississippi. I think it is Mississippi's famously like the poorest and least educated state in the country. I mean, occasionally on some metrics they make it up to 48th. Alaska has a bad year or something. Not Alaska. What's it? Alabama has a bad year or something. But yeah, it's a grim place, Mississippi. Pleased they decided to take the Confederate flag out. It's surprisingly positive. Oh my God, yeah. Local Cool Extreme asked thoughts on the 2 white lawyers who decided to meet protesters in their neighborhood with terrible gun discipline. I don't have any thoughts other than they really are just some amazing pictures. If you've all seen them, it's just this sort of portly white guy with a pink polo shirt and a AR-15 sort of assault rifle, and then his wife, sort of aging trophy wife looking wife, just sort of there with a weirdly handling a pistol, and they think they're so tough, and they just look like such idiots. And could have potentially killed a lot of people, and I'm glad they didn't. Yeah, it's God, open carry is just the worst thing imaginable, and I think it's horrifyingly likely that at some point in the next year, we're going to see one of these packs of assholes showing up with their machine guns, and it's going to just turn into a bloodbath. Unfortunately, it's not something to wish for, obviously, but I think that's sort of probably what's going to happen. What people aren't paying enough attention to is that back in the 1990s, we had another huge wave of sort of militia stuff. The Michigan militia, in fact, became nationally, if not internationally, famous. A lot of folks, just were angry at the government and were pissed that that we had a Democratic president. They did militias, and it was a huge deal, and it was a big thing. And then one person who was affiliated to the militia blew up a federal building in Oklahoma City, murdering about 170 people. Really iconic picture of like a dead baby being held by a fireman, just really grim stuff. And all of a sudden, that militia movement just sort of evaporated. And unfortunately, I think we're due for another one of those. One of these armed protesters is going to, shoot a politician, or that will actually get a gun battle at some state capitol, and then yeah, it's amazing how quickly a lot of these open carry laws will change, or even actually the laws won't have to change at all. I think just people just stop doing it. They'll just sort of stop showing up with the guns. So yeah, kind of sad. So yeah, don't have much to say on those trigger discipline assholes. 6 viewers, 7 viewers, very exciting. Local Cool Extreme says, More Freedom Foundation, I'm still wrapping my mind about how the US saved the stock market. It just decided to print money, which is exactly what Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and post-World War I Germany did, and ruined them. I'm not exactly sure that's what happened with Germany, but I do believe, or even with Venezuela, and I don't know the Zimbabwe story at all, but yes, like absolutely printing money was sort of part of the problem. The thing is, none of those folks were as hegemonic as the United States is. So the world financial system, monetary systems everywhere are completely dependent on the Federal Reserve. So the Federal, what do they call it? Exorbitant privilege. And man, that exorbitant privilege of being the U.S. Reserve, the dollar being the world reserve currency. I can't remember who it was who said that. Probably some French politician. But the exorbitant privilege of the dollar being the world's reserve currency. That quote, I'm pretty sure, predates 2008. That was before we even knew just how much privilege there was in that. Yeah, so far, like if there's no alternative, and there remains no alternative because China and Europe just continues to be more fucked up than the US is, economically speaking, then yeah, the dollar will continue. There's this it's very weird. If you're a Fed watcher, if you're someone who pays attention to currency and finance, there's two very different narratives of what's going on right now. There's sort of like the popular political obvious narrative, and then there's sort of the financial Fed related narrative. Because the obvious political thing is like the United States has failed extraordinarily miserably. Donald Trump is a historical embarrassment. How is the United States ever going to come back from this? How is U.S. power? Is anybody ever going to believe in that again? This is just such an extraordinary fuck up, disaster, nightmare, blah, blah, blah. All of that is true, of course, but it doesn't reckon with the hard facts of the financial system, which is basically over the past 3 months, the United States Federal Reserve didn't just save the U.S. economy, it saved the world economy. And the entire world is tremendously dependent on the U.S. economy. And I think they are as horrified by that as you would imagine they would be. And I'm sure there are people in every world capital casting about desperately for alternatives. The problem is there are alternatives at this point as sort of a reserve currency, or China, which looks as terrifying as it has since Tiananmen back in 1989, and more terrifying than it has at any point since 1989, or Europe, which is just a basket case. Some folks have made the argument to me recently that Europe's actually responding in positive ways in response to COVID, but I haven't had the time to sort of the European Union project has responded in positive ways to COVID, but I haven't had the time or inclination to sort of track that down yet and develop an opinion on that. But yeah, it's at this point, that would be very bad for the United States if Europe finally got its shit together. Because the ability, then yes, then we would be in a position where it's like, oh, well, the US is a disaster area, and we don't have to look to them for financial leadership anymore. But the story of 2020 thus far is very different. If you look at sort of the economic underpinnings, is very different from the popular idea that, oh, the US is done, US world leadership's over, welcome back to multipolarity. Because from the financial perspective, from the Federal Reserve, the United States looks more powerful than it ever has, which is just kind of mind-bending. Because the U.S. is, Gilad says it's because the U.S. is a service economy, which, has some aspects of truth to that. Local Cool Extreme says, is it fair to say that the U.S. is in the middle of a cold civil war? I would say no. I don't think so. I don't think any of that. I think that, yeah, there's partisanship in the United States, but this sort of like, oh, we're so divided. I think it's all horseshit. Like, I think it's, no, it's not all horseshit. Partisanship is high. It's, problematic, yada, yada. But I've noticed, I think probably, guy I follow on Twitter has started just talking about it as the cold civil war, and I think that overstates it. I think that we all, social media just made it a little more apparent to a lot of people how everybody thinks, and it's been a little horrifying. But I think that we are in the process. Trump has been kind enough to deliver the country a tremendous course correction. Yeah, I don't like that cold civil war terminology. I just think, I still think the 60s were worse. It was interesting because there was this moment like when every city in the country started like dissolving into riots. We're like, oh, finally, this does look as bad as the 1960s. And then within a week of that, it's like, oh, actually, no, there aren't any riots. Like the rioting was like a 2 or 3 day thing. Yeah, maybe some people are pulling down statues or whatever, but actually it's mostly peaceful protest. And it's like, wow, it's like we had all the positive bits of the 60s without the negativity. Like, so yeah, I think it's pretty overblown, frankly, the cold civil war thing. Yeah, I mean, there's political disagreement. It's a democracy. It's also, fortunately or unfortunately, the most powerful country in the world still. So yeah, that has all kinds of weird effects. So yeah, I don't like the cold civil war terminology. Coronavirus recession isn't that worse than 1929. Oh, Jesus, if that's your standards, Gilad. But yeah, that's interesting. I was sort of taught like really like when this stimulus ends, and I do think like, yeah, sure, print money forever, money printer go brr, da da da, whatever. Like, yeah, I do think there's a real hard limit to that sort of thing that is bigger than we'd expected, but I do think it is something we will hit. Basically, if China or Europe ever gets their shit together, then yeah, then all of a sudden the U.S. fiscal picture gets jacked right back into the real world, and we're fucked. So yeah, I don't think we can just print money forever. So yeah, when stimulus ends, like I think we are going to find ourselves in a Great Depression situation. I think that if things happen intelligently, then maybe it'll be like a 2 or 3 year thing rather than a decade-long thing. But yeah, I think this is potentially as bad as the Great Depression. We just need to make sure it's not as long-lasting as the Great Depression. Says Local Extreme. Rami Ilkilic asks, if the printed money is spent on goods and services, it will produce inflation. That is bad. If it is channeled in the stock market, it will produce a rally. That is good in the short run. Yeah, I don't know, man. I don't understand money, man. I keep trying, and the more I learn is that nobody else does either. I think that everybody's been expecting inflation for a really long time, and it just hasn't happened to the point where it's like people are worried about deflation. And I think that while, yeah, okay, let's inflate the asset prices is certainly worked for a lot of people I know, and for a lot of people in the world, it is fundamentally unjust to the majority of Americans, the majority of people in the world. So I don't know, man. I can't answer all the questions, but I do know that's an important question. But yeah, Rami, that's I don't know. I just don't have the mental capacity right now to think about the stock market. It's so perplexing. Gilad says Twitter isn't real life. In 2015, I thought the YouTube comment section was out on the dock in the lake, and I'd like to join them. But I'm also very happy to be here with you folks. If you've got any more questions for me, we've got we're at an hour and 40 minutes. I do. Oh wait, how did we go from an hour? Yeah, we're at about questions. Oh God damn it! Seriously, seriously, are we back? Are we back? I seem to be having internet trouble, but okay, it's stabilizing. All right. Do we have questions? Because the lake looks very inviting, and I've been doing this for an hour and a half, which I am okay with. I'm also perfectly happy to do this for another half hour if I have questions. We're down to 6 now. Man, gosh. 5. Oh no. Gilad, do you have a question that's not about video games? Okay. Now we're back up to 6. Hello. All right. I'm terror groups. Gilad wants me to talk about terror groups. Well, that's don't you'd have to specify a little more. Don't have a ton to say about that. Okay. That's a vital question from Loga. Will the Republican fuckwits responsible for bungling this crisis receive any sort of electoral comeuppance? What I've been thinking about recently a lot is not 2020, when I am becoming more and more confident that they will receive their electoral comeuppance. What I'm thinking about now is 2022. Because what happened, like, this is a rerun. In 2008, the Republicans got their asses handed to them. Barack Obama, the first African American president, won. I think it wasn't a landslide, but he won. And the Democrats took the House and the Senate. I think they had a majority. I think they had a super majority in the Senate after 2008. And it was squandered. Basically, the Democrats sort of did infighting for 2 years and did actually, manage to pass Obamacare, which, as I get into middle age and deal with doctors more, I realize just how important things like dealing with pre-existing conditions and plan maximums, how important that was, however poorly implemented it may have been in some ways. But then in 2010, the Republicans came sweeping back with sort of Tea Party stuff. I gotta hope that after this fucking incredible disaster, people are gonna pay less attention to the Republicans. I mean, this is 9/11, the Iraq War, it's 2008, and now the Trump virus. This was all given to us by Republicans, by the Republican Party. I did a video on that a couple months back called "The Fourth Republican Disaster," and I gotta hope that people are a little smarter than to do what we did in 2010 and give the Republicans all kinds of power back. I think it was 2010, right, that Obama famously described as a shellacking. They just got their asses beat, and I gotta hope that we're not that stupid, dumb enough to do that again. But who knows? Who knows? Um, um, so yeah, but I'm very confident the Republicans are going to get their comeuppance in 2020. I think it's possible that we're going to see DC become a state, which is just like, I mean, talk about like Donald Trump's left-wing legacy. I think, yeah, I think Washington DC could become a state in the next year or so, and that's just like that does change the math of the Senate and makes it much harder for the Republicans to hold on to the minority power they've had. And I'm perfectly fucking fine with it. Actually, I would see actually making DC a state a way to preserve Senate power because it's if you look at the map, like I believe in the Senate. It's another video I've been meaning to make for quite some time. I think it's actually vitally important that we have this other geographical basis for power in the U.S. government. I don't know that California or Texas would have ever had the chance to exist the way that they do if if power in the U.S. government was exclusively rationed according to population. However, I do believe that it is getting ridiculous enough at this point that I think it'd be useful for the long-term viability and legitimacy for the Senate to throw another couple Democrats in there. Because at this point, we're like, it's like, you know, as we saw, because the electoral college is similar. You have the Trump loses by 2 million votes, and then is somehow the president. And then you've got a similar dynamic working with the Senate, whereas the balance of power in the Senate is held by people from Wyoming, which is just absurd when you consider that a senator from Wyoming has the same vote as a senator from California. It's not absurd. There are reasons for that, reasons that I believe in. But I think it would be good to throw another couple votes to make that math less fucked up to the Democrats. So I think it would actually be great for the country if DC was given congressional representation as a full state. And the thing is, I think that looks very possible next year, which changes things for the better. Local Cool Extreme asks a question. It says, why are Republicans even bothering with the abortion culture war nonsense when they've already lost it? Won't they simply move on like they did with gay marriage? That's not actually true. If you look at the polling, if you look at they have absolutely lost gay marriage. They've lost trans rights, which was honestly kind of surprising to me. They've lost the idea of any kind of family values being represented by the Republican Party with Trump as its figurehead is, of course, absolutely laughable. A man is completely free of morals and dignity, as you can imagine. However, abortion is a topic that retains its salience, that will drive many Republican votes this fall and every fall to come. The losing on abortion is not something they've ever really done. It's sort of the abortion issue has been in this weird stasis since 1973, and it wasn't even until 1972, 1973 with Roe v. Wade, and it wasn't even until the latter 70s or the 80s, and with more intensity going into the 90s and later, that the Republicans decided to make abortion an issue. And they don't want to win on an abortion. I think I did a video talking about this a couple of weeks back. Like, if somehow Roe v. Wade were overturned and every state could decide its own abortion laws, why would I do believe that a solid 25% of Republican voters only vote on that issue. So it's not in the Republicans' interests to actually win on that issue. So yeah, the abortion is not like gay marriage. Gay marriage it's gone. Like opposing gay marriage is a weird minority issue at this point. Abortion remains kind of 50-50 in the country. And as you go to sort of the edge cases, like, oh, what about last trimester? It's not 50-50 in this country. It's actually probably in favor of some restrictions. So abortion is and remains a very powerful and useful issue for the Republicans. Gay marriage is done, gone. It's amazing. In 2004, gay marriage probably turned the election for Bush in 2004, and now a Republican wouldn't even dare running against. Yeah, back in 2004, George W. Bush ran against gay marriage, and that probably won him a tight election in 2004. no Republican would dare to run on that now. It was fun in 2015, 2016. Huckabee and Rick Santorum and Mike Huckabee, who were two basically famous anti-gay rights Republican politicians. They both threw their ring into the nomination process in 2015, and they both had to sort of slink home. I mean, they weren't even a factor in the nomination process because everybody acknowledged that they were cancerous. You know, they were diseased. There was no way that someone who'd made their career on opposing gay marriage could even get the Republican nomination anymore. And that's fantastic. I think I've got a video on Rick Santorum and Mike Huckabee called "Attack of the Hate Zombies." It's one of my least watched videos. You can search that out if you like. But yeah, they're done. Gilad says, I finally know where some of the U.S. states are on the map. Honestly, until my 20s, I didn't know where most of the states were on the map. It's pretty embarrassing. Gilad says, the left has a weird tendency to believe in conspiracies, just like the right. Everybody loves conspiracies. Mert Muftu says, that is an interesting view on Ara's take on the use of abortion for keeping the voter base. Never occurred to me before. Oh, yeah, for sure. Like, that's like... yeah, I mean, the Republicans, there couldn't be anything worse for the Republicans than overturning Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade is the landmark case that gave, I think it's the right to privacy, but in practice, it means that women are allowed to get abortions countrywide. States can't meaningfully. Well, of course, what it means, there's all kinds of, there's a number of. If that were overturned, it would be a serious problem. If it were overturned, it would be a very serious problem for the Republicans. So, that's a grim question. Logan Cool Extreme asks, so how long until Ghislaine? How long until Ghislaine Maxwell commits suicide? I don't know. I think it's pretty likely. God, that'd be embarrassing. Oh, wow. Local Cool Extreme. It's just, oh man, I'm embarrassed that people know about this internationally. Mike Huckabee invited the weirdo clerk who refused to issue gay marriage to a couple with the song "Eye of the Tiger." That was trippy, man. 2016 was weird. Yeah. God, I'd forgotten about that clerk. I made a video about her. I can't remember what her name is anymore. But yeah, it's really fascinating just looking even 4 years back how far Trump has pushed this country to the left. Yeah, I mean, in 2012, like I was a Romney supporter. Now I'm like, man, I need to read some books on FDR. I think I like that guy. It's personally in my family, in the country at large. Trump has set a lot of what he claimed to like about America on fire. I'm okay with it. So, all right, I think we're at about an hour and 40 minutes. Not seeing a ton of questions. We got 7 people here, and I feel like I'm only hearing from Loga and Gilad. Let me say thank you to all of you for showing up for this. I'm committed to doing this every month now. It is fantastic that you folks have chosen to support me. I'm very grateful. And yeah, I want to keep doing this. I think it's fun to do. It's sort of less formal. I feel like I have to be a little less prepared than I have to be for the bigger live casts. And it's nice that I actually get to interact with people. Gilad says Idaho rocks. Not sure why. Actually, people are loving Idaho. I've known a lot of friends from California who fantasize about moving to Idaho, which should be nice because that's like the last red state in the West. Perfectly fine with flipping that. Oh God, Local Cool Extreme coming at me with the all lives matter argument. What about the black on black crime? I actually made a video on this called "Black on Black Crime is a Myth," and I think that answers this question in great detail. Most black people are killed by black people. You know what? Most white people are killed by white people. All be. It's sort of a kind of a manufactured thing for me. Yeah, Mert Muftiil says, I only read the headline, but I heard Biden released a big investment package. I hope it has a large infrastructure improvement element. So do I. This country is falling apart. Okay, it's been an hour and 45 minutes. I think I'm going to call it. Super grateful to all you folks. Yeah, I got to figure, I think we've got an Ethernet cable up here. I need to jack myself directly into the modem before I try to do the big live stream, which I got to do in the next 2 weeks or so. Y'all are great. Thanks so much. I'm psyched that we seem to have had like 6 to 9 people watching this time, despite my big screw up. We've had people showing up. I'm very grateful. So thank you, and y'all are the best.